Hey everybody, welcome back to the Miser's Guide to Evony. This series is going to be a little bit different. I'm starting one called The Art of War, where I'm going to talk about my understanding of the battle mechanics and how things work in terms of PvP combat and so on in Evony. This is kind of a difficult topic because there's not a lot of documentation, a lot of material provided by Evony, and it's really just experimentation and guesswork and experience that really leads to a lot of these conclusions. Now, because of that, some of it may be wrong. Some of it may be interpreted in different ways by different people. So I'm going to give you a disclaimer first that take everything you hear with a grain of salt. The information in this video and in future videos in this series are, well, first, they're simplified, and I'm trying to make it simple enough that people can understand what's going on without getting too bogged down by details because it can get really complex at different levels. It's also speculative knowledge. I don't know for a fact whether any of these things are true. These are just things that I believe to be true based on experience and what I've seen. And also keep in mind that anything I say could in future patches become obsolete. This has happened in the past where some player knowledge was rendered obsolete by some changes by Evony in different patches. So keep that in mind that in the distant future, who knows, some of this stuff could be completely useless and I'll have to redo. But I don't expect any of the recent patches, anything coming up to change a whole lot. So the basic mechanics and stuff will very likely not change. And the last thing I'll say is different people have different interpretations, like I said before. So there are going to be people that don't agree with me, and that is perfectly fine. You choose what you want to take out of these videos. I'm making these videos for you so that you can get a better understanding, but not everything here is going to be 100% accurate, and I don't think anybody can give 100% accuracy to any of this detail outside of Evony themselves who have the code. So keep that in mind as we go through this series. So let's start off with the basic battle system. I want to talk about my understanding of how the battle system itself works. I'm going to talk about the field of battle. I'm going to talk about the stats that different units have, the kinds of purposes, the strengths and weaknesses of the units. I'm going to do a simplistic comparison of all the different units. I'm going to talk about speed and range, what those mean and how they work in a battle. I'm going to talk about units and their counter units, so what's effective against them. I'm going to talk about the idea of layers, just a very simple introduction to layers, and I'm kind of going to try to get you to visualize how layers actually function and why they are so important. Now that's a lot of information for one video, so I've had to simplify it, and just keep that in mind that everything here is simplified. Okay, so here is how I envision the field of battle. Now, again, this is simplified, so you only see 4 troops here. You see catapults, you see archers, you see cavalry, and you see the ground units. But keep in mind that each of those is going to also have multiple different tiers. So tier 1, tier 2, all the way up to tier 14. So it is simplified, but this is basically how the field of battle, in my mind, is set up. You have 2 opposing armies. It doesn't matter whether there's a building involved or whatever. I don't think that actually has any effect other than the buffs themselves. Like, there's no physical wall or anything you have to break down. It's just 2 armies standing on opposite sides of the battle. And when the battle commences, what actually happens is these units start to move forward towards each other, depending on their speed. And that's something I'm going to talk about in a little while. So apologies as I'm turning my head here to move some units. But they start to approach each other. And they get closer and closer, and then they start engaging in combat based on whether the units that are approaching them are within their range of attack. So that's how the field of battle looks to me. I'm going to talk about the unit stats next. So I'm going to quickly go into some of the information sections of some of the units. So let's take a look, for example, at stables here. If you look at, whoops, I'm in the wrong place. I want to actually go into train, and I want to click here on I. So if you look at the units themselves, every tier has a different graphic, which, yeah, we know. And if you click on the I, it tells you the attack, defense, and all this different information here. Some of them are clickable, and they'll give you a little tooltip that tell you the technology boost, but not all of them are. So they tell you basically what the unit's attack defense is. And it is impacted by buffs and stuff. So this is not the base. What you're seeing here is not what the tier 14 unit actually does. This is after some of the gear and stuff is taken into consideration. So these numbers are not completely accurate for just a starting level 14 unit. But it does tell you some information. You have attack, you have defense, and your HP. Those are the primary 3 stats that the units use in battle. You have speed, which is how fast a unit moves across the field of battle. You have range. When a unit is within 50 range of cavalry, the cavalry will be able to attack them. The load is how many units of resources a unit can carry. So after you've attacked a city, for example, or you've sent them to gather at a resource tile, this is how many units of resource that they can bring back in their load. Upkeep is how much food is consumed, and that is per hour, I believe. And then you have power, which is how much power you get for each individual unit, how much keep power, how much power you get applied to your total score for your kingdom. Okay. So first we'll look at siege. Siege, I might as well click this one. So siege over here. If I look at these stats here, I did a quick comparison. So attack, defense, HP, speed, and range. And what I tried to do is I tried to rank them in terms of what the stronger units are for different categories. So if you see something that is in green, then they are at the top of the pack. They have the best of that stat. If you see something in yellow, they're kind of in the middle of the pack. They're pretty good at it, but not necessarily the best. And if you see something in red, they're at the lower end of the pack. So siege naturally have very low attack, defense, and HP, and their speed is also very limited. They cannot cross field of battle very quickly. Not that you would want them to. You don't want them to. But what they lack in all those stats is made up for in their range. They have by far the greatest range of any unit in Evony. So they do have lower attack and so on, but that doesn't matter because they really get to attack other units first. So that is something to keep in mind, that they excel at range. Archers, on the other hand, are also a ranged unit, kind of like siege, but they're not quite as high. So you look at the range, it was like 2,200 on siege. Let me go back real quick. It was 2,000, yeah, basically 2,200 units of range, whereas archers are only 500. Now that is a good range still, but what that means is they can't attack other units until those units come within 500 units of them. So that gives a chance for the other units to quickly approach them if they're fast enough, or if they don't kill them all, and then they can really get seriously damaged there. So to compensate for that, they have higher attack, defense, and HP than siege units do. They have slightly higher speed than siege units, but they're not really masters of anything. They have higher range than melee units. They have pretty good attack, defense, and HP, but they're not the best at anything. That isn't to say that they are not very important. So keep that in mind too as we go through this. Cavalry. I click on cavalry here. The range, like I said before, is down to 50. So that's the standard melee unit. So within 50 pieces or melee, within 50 units of within the field of battle. So if you have another unit that's within 50 paces or 50 units, that's pretty close to them basically. They'll be able to now attack that unit, whereas the archers were 500. Their speed, however, is at the top of the pack, and their attack as well. They have really high attack and really high speed. What that means is if your cavalry actually make it to other units, they can deal a lot of damage. But they actually have to make it there first. They have pretty good defense and pretty good HP, but they're not the best at those either. Lastly, we have the ground units. The ground units are the best at defense and HP. So you can see the points are way higher for defense and HP than other units, and that's because they're really like tanks. They are ones that march across the battlefield. They take a lot of damage before they die. They don't have super strong attack, but because they can absorb so much damage, you'll still have a lot of them left to attack other units. And that's really where they shine with the defense and HP. Their speed isn't quite as fast as a cavalry unit, which is, what, it was 500, I believe? But they do go pretty quickly anyway, which is kind of shocking considering all this armor that they're wearing. They must have some pretty strong legs. They also can carry quite a bit of load, which makes them good for gathering or for attacking cities and plundering resources. Siege are the best at that, but ground units, when they get wounded, they go to your hospital as opposed to siege, so they're a good choice there too. But they are primarily used for soaking up damage when you are attacking. Okay, so here's a side-by-side comparison of the 4 different types of units at tier 14. And this is, again, using my own stats, so they're not the base stats of the units, they're just a general idea of where units are at. So you can kind of see in the reds, those are the ones that are weaker stats, and the greens are the ones that are stronger stats. Yellow are somewhere in between. All right. I want to talk a little bit about how speed and range worked. I kind of showed you and alluded to some of this as I was going through the units, but it looks a little bit easier on the field of battle if you can see it visually. So I attached some arrows next to units to kind of give a rough idea of how big the range is for each of the units. So the 2 melee units, you have the cavalry and the warriors, the ground, that don't have significant range. They only attack within 50 units. You have the archers that attack within 500. So these arrows are actually way too long. They should be somewhere like here instead. And the siege machines can attack within like 2,200. So everybody starts off being a little bit too far away from the other units to actually attack. But after one round of battle, your units have marched a little bit. So your siege have moved forward. Your archers have moved forward as well, slightly more than the siege, because they can march a little faster. The cavalry have moved quite a bit more because they have very high speed, and the warriors have moved forward because quite a bit as well, because they're almost as fast as the cavalry. But now that the siege have moved forward, notice that the arrows are within each other. So the first ones that actually get to attack are the siege. The siege attack the siege because I think my interpretation here is that they'll target the highest threat unit. So right now, if you have siege that's getting attacked by siege, well, the siege is going to fire back at the other siege. And that's what you really see modeled in battles. If you attack with siege, you typically kill siege and vice versa. So the siege here are pounding out against each other, and they're going to do that for a couple rounds until one of them is decimated. And if one of these siege units gets killed, and I'll move it off here, then this is now going to move on to other units, so possibly the ranged troops. And that's what I often see. Let's move forward a little bit more. So these guys are going to move forward, and they're probably going to be able to attack each other, or they might even go past each other and start facing off against the ground, depending on how the layers work and how the battle started. But it looks something like this. There's a big cluster of melee attacking melee. And the archers, meanwhile, have moved forward enough as well that the archers can begin to attack cavalry and ground on both sides of the battle. If one of the units, I suppose, or two of the units are wiped out, these guys will continue to move forward, and they'll start to attack other units. So that's kind of a simplistic idea of how the field of battle works. It's lacking a lot of detail, and it's kind of on the fly here, but it should give you an idea of generally how this system works. There's a couple notes here I want to point out. Troops attack whatever is in their range. So that seems obvious, right? You can't attack something that's outside of your range. But what I mean by that is they prioritize what's a threat to them first. They also prioritize based on advantage. These, again, are speculation, but I think that if an archer troop, for example, has the option between firing at cavalry and firing at ground, it's going to fire at cavalry first because it's a higher threat to them because they can move quickly. Speculation. Troops prioritize their matching layers, then move on to other layers of the same troop type. What I mean by that is if you have tier 12 attacking another enemy, they're going to hit the tier 12 of that enemy first, and then when they wipe out that tier 12, they'll move on to something else. But they will first attack the same tier level, whatever troop it will attack the same tier level first, if it's in range. Okay. I'm going to look at every unit individually and kind of try to point out some things that I've noticed. Siege first. What I've noticed is siege attacks siege. And that's particularly because they come in range of each other and they are high priority targets of each other. So siege will attack siege. If your enemy siege ends up getting wiped out completely, then they'll start to attack other troops, and what I've seen is it's usually archers that get picked off by siege. But that might not always be the case. I think it would depend on how many rounds it takes to wipe out the siege. The archer unit. The archer unit attacks the first unit which comes into their range, and this is usually going to be cavalry because cavalry just moves so quickly across the battlefield. So I think that's why the cavalry are wiped out by archers, and it's more because of the range that they come into first. And archers, their strength is really that they can decimate cavalry. They can completely wipe out cavalry very, very quickly. They're very strong at that. Cavalry. Cavalry can cross the field of battle very quickly. They have the highest speed of any troop in the game, so they are really good at that. What happens is because they run across the field so quickly, they first come into contact with other cavalry and ground units. If they've wiped out those, they will continue on and they can deal some serious damage to your siege and your archers, but usually at that point there's very few of them left, and that's why they don't do so much damage. But if there's only, for example, siege left on your opponent, a cavalry attack can really wipe out the siege because they can cross the battle very quickly, and you won't lose so much of them because siege don't have very high attack to wipe them out. But cavalry are also very strong against ground, and that's primarily because their attack is very, very high, so they're one of the few units that can dish out enough damage to overcome the strong defenses of ground units. Ground units. Ground units, they come across cavalry and other ground units first on the battlefield. If they can get past the melee units that they come across first, then the ground unit will continue marching and it will come into contact with the ranged units of the opponent. And because archers don't have super strong attack, they have okay attack, but because it's not super strong, archers really have to rely on wiping out the ground before they make it to them. Because once they've made it to them, archers don't have nearly the same strength in terms of hit points and defense as ground do, and they can just get completely wiped out by ground units very, very quickly. Okay, we're coming close to the end of this long video. The last things that I want to talk about are called layers. What a layer is a different, a kind of a a tier list in a battle of all the different tiers that you might have in units. So I'm going to pull up a march, for example. It's easier to show it than it is to explain it. Okay, let's choose something like this. Okay, so what I mean by layers is if I scroll down, you'll see that I have tier 14 and I have tier 13. I have some really strong units, but you'll notice that I have, in my March preset, I have units of every tier. All the way down, even down to tier 1. I have everything included in my March preset. The reason I have that is because when you are coming across the field of battle, when your troops are marching, I talked about how they face off against the other tiers of other units. So I have my tier 1 facing off against tier 1, tier 2 facing off against tier 2, all the way up. If I'm missing those layers and I just send 1.5 million tier 14 against somebody that has a whole bunch of different kinds of troops, they're all going to be attacking my tier 14. I don't want that to happen because I value my tier 14. They have really high attack, really high defense, and really high HP. But when everything is focused on them, they'll take a lot more damage than they would as opposed to if I had layers. Now, if I have layers and I'm attacking a city, I don't care whether that player has millions in terms of their different tiers. They're going to attack the same tier level. So my tier 14 might be saved from a round or two of attacks from the enemy opponent's other tiers just because those layers exist. It depends on how quickly they kill my layers. So it's a very simplistic way of looking at it. And I'm going to talk about layers quite a bit more in the future, but I'll just leave it here for now and say that layers are extremely important to both defense and offense. You have to have layers. And that includes other sources of layers other than your own units. That includes subsidies, reinforcements, and other ways that you can get other tier levels of troops into your army composition. You just want to make sure you have as many layers as possible, whether those layers are layers of 1 or a million. They just have to really exist. If they don't exist, then you'll run into some serious problems. Here's a very quick and simple way of looking at how layers work. I think of it like a zipper. The different parts of the zipper match up to their corresponding piece, right? So in the image that I have here, you have your tier 1 that are going to be zipped up and your tier 2, tier 3, and they're all going to match their individual piece. But if some of these zipper pieces are broken, let's say the tier 6 and the tier 5 have disappeared, then these opponents tier 6 and tier 5 are going to be able to choose whatever they want to attack. They're pretty much free. They're not locked into anything. They're free to attack wherever they want, and usually it works its way upwards. So those tier 5, tier 6 are now going to attack the tier 7, which makes it easier to wipe out those tier 7, and it kind of scales upward, and you're losing the really good troops that you want to maintain for as long as possible. Okay. And that's about it for this video. I have a whole series planned that I'm going to do some discussion on the art of war and different things, but I do want to stop this one here because it's a lot of information and it's all coming really, really quickly, so good place to stop. But I do want to say a quick thank you to the people that have become channel members and are supporting the Miser's Guide to Evony. It's very appreciated, and I want to make sure that I appreciate you in every video that I do. And if you do want to become a member, you just need to click the join button at the top right, or I don't know, just below the video somewhere on there, and you can get access to different perks and so on that you might, but more importantly, you are just supporting the Miser's Guide to Evony. Also consider to join the Discord channel if you have not done so, because there's a great community of people in there that help each other and discuss elements of the game, and that is definitely a great place to be. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe and like if you have not already done so.